There is a particular part of earlier colonial period that is neglected and skimmed over during the school's indoctrination process on American history. And so in the schools, the child's minds are imprinted with vivid images and stories about the Negro being a slave. But what is rarely discussed is the establishment of the earlier American colonies using European servitude, which in many respects, it mirrored Negro slave conditions. And so this hidden history is exactly what we're going to discuss right now. And to do that, we're going to go into this book here. It's called The Shaping of Black America, written by historian Lerone Bennett Jr. So let's open up this book, and we're going to go on here to page 39, where it says this. Although great care has been taken to hide the fact black bondsmen inherited their chains from white bondsmen who were, in manner of speaking, America's first slaves. Now, he's going to repeatedly use the term white in here, but during this time, we have to understand that these earlier servants would not have been called that. They would have been called primarily by their ethnic or national origin name, right? An Irishman or a Englishman, things of that nature. And so what period are we talking about? We're talking about the early 17th century or the 1600s. And like I said, at that time, they were not referred to as white people. That term came later on in the 1600s. And so Mr. Lerone Bennett right here, he's saying that there is an attempt to hide the fact that the Europeans were, in fact, the first slaves in America in the early 17th century. And so let's continue on as he presents his case. Here we go. And as America moved in the middle of the 17th century toward a faithful decision that would define it forever, increasing attention was directed to the status of those white servants who pioneered in both servitude and slavery. And what happened during the middle of the 17th century? The colonial rulers, they made a shift, or at least they started looking more towards Negro slaves, right? Before, they primarily relied on European labor in these earlier periods. And then they began to increase the usage of the Negro labor in the middle of the 17th century, right? And you can see it in the laws and a lot of the documents that they left behind, and making them into permanent slaves, right? It became obvious. And so we're talking about the English rulers who were the controllers of these colonies. We're not talking about the Spanish or the Portuguese who had been using Negroes since the 14 and the 1500s, right? We're talking about the English and primarily in America, right? So stay focused. Here we go. To understand what happened in the second half of the 17th century, 1600s, one must first understand what happened to these whites in the first and second halves of the 17th century. For they ran the first leg of the marathon of American servitude before passing on the baton of anguish to the reds and the blacks. The story of this succession, the story of how white servants passed on the torch of forced labor to blacks, and how whites created a system of white servitude that lasted in America for more than 200 years, has never been told before in all its dimensions. And he has a footnote on the page that basically says that historians have been making obvious attempts to downplay or to minimize the importance of this white servitude, right? And so he's basically saying that they're trying to smooth it over, right? And gloss over it. And I would assume that one of the reasons that they would do this is that they don't want to amplify the image of Europeans as slaves, right? Because that would symbolize that their ancestors were on a similar level as the Negroes, right? And many people, they feel comfortable when Negroes or black people are the ones that are playing the role of the slaves. But it creates a feeling of discomfort, and it makes people question their feeling of superiority when they find out that their ancestors were not treated much different, right? And especially to find out that those colonial rulers, they would have had no problem keeping those lower class Europeans in a permanent position of servitude if that system would have worked out better, right? Because it's a rude awakening. It's a rude awakening to find out that everyone that you thought was on the same team as you is really not, right? And those colonial rulers were not on the same team as the poor, right? Those poor servant class of Europeans, even though some try to hide it. Now let's continue. For obvious reasons, the traditional embalmers of the American experience seem to find white servitude enormously embarrassing, right? And I bet they do. They generally ignore it. dwelling instead on black servitude. Right? You see that? Here we go. But this maneuver, and it is precisely that, distorts both black bondage and the American experience. For white bondage and red bondage are the missing legs on the triangle of American servitude, a triangle that defines the initial American experience as an experiment in compulsion. Both red and white bondage were integral parts of that experiment, but white bondage was particularly important for two reasons. In the first place, white bondage lasted for more than 2 centuries and involved most of the first white immigrants to the American colonies. It has been estimated that at least 2 out of every 3 immigrants to the colonies south of New York worked for a term of years in the fields or kitchens as semi-slaves, right? Out in the fields, toiling in the blazing sun. Here we go. The second and possibly more important reason for the centrality of white servitude is that it was, as Eric Williams noted, the historic base upon which Negro slavery was constructed. In other words, white servitude was the proving ground for the mechanisms of control and subordination used later in African American slavery. Now, in school, I remember only hearing a little bit about indentured servants, right? And that was it. But the way they explained it is as if there were people who were working like regular jobs and treated like employees of today. And that it was the Negro who was out there doing all of the hard work and treated like an animal. But Mr. Lerone Bennett Jr., he's saying that that was not the case. But rather, the slave masters, they first developed all of these cruel tactics on the first European servants, right? Here we go. The plantation pass system, the slave trade, the sexual exploitation of servant women, the whipping post and slave chain and branding iron, the overseer, the house servant, the Uncle Tom. All these mechanisms were tried out and perfected first on white men and women. And I would add that these were likely developed on them to a high degree. And I would say that they were ultimately perfected on the Negro because the objective was to make the Negro a permanent slave. And the objective for the poor Europeans was to squeeze out as much work from them before their labor contract was up, right? But I get the point that he's making, which is that they already had these systems in place and developed to a high degree before they were used on the Negro. Now let's continue reading. As in the case of black bondage, the controlling cause was not biology, but economic demand as refracted through the peculiar prism of European power groups with little or no sympathy for the poor and underprivileged. And I'm telling you that some of those ruling class people were expressing extreme ruthless character traits, and they were willing to do whatever was necessary to get power and to get profits, right? Let's continue. The opening of the New World gave a new twist to the peculiar perceptions of those groups and brought to the surface Europe's ancient Athens and enduring the Third Reich fascination with unfree labor. And it was this fascination, the unfree labor, honed to a fine edge by the possibility of colossal profits that condemned millions of blacks, reds, and whites to the horrors of extended servitude. The very important point here is that both black and white bondage grew out of and reflected the internal tensions of Europe. These tensions resolved around certain ideas about the proper subordination of white people and a new milieu of competitive egoism growing out of the Renaissance and the commercial revolution. And out of this, there finally emerged a new spirit of adventure and ruthlessness that included a certain contempt for all human beings and a willingness to use any and every expedient in the search for gold, glory, and conquest for God. You see that? A willingness to use any and everything. And this includes using the ideas of God, religion, color, race, creating black and white people, or any and everything to set up the environment to exploit people for those people's own gain. That's what they were willing to do. And there's still people that exist like this today, right? From all parts of the world, all colors and all creeds. But let's continue. These mental attitudes reflected, in turn, certain material contradictions in Europe, which was a confused and afflicted place on the eve of colonial expansion. The situation was brazenly turbulent in England, where the upper classes were engaged in the bloody process of driving the peasants from the land. And they were looking to find a nice and cozy place for those peasant people to go, right? Let's continue. One consequence of this process was that the relief rolls of the country, on the eve of the founding of the plantations of Virginia and Massachusetts, bulged with supplicants, and the roads swarmed with beggars, vagabonds, and thieves. It was this setting of social nightmare that England embarked on its career of colonialism. So England was facing a big social problem, with the streets being filled with criminals and beggars, which prompted England to go and set out to find new land. But why did they need to go out and find new land? Let's find out. The primary reason for this departure was the idea that England needed a dumping ground for its undesirables, to take all the criminals and the people who weren't working and cleanse them from the land, right? That's what he's saying was the main reason for their colonial mission. Let's continue. As Francis Bacon put it in a state paper delivered to James I in 1606, colonization gave England a double commodity: in the avoidance of people here and in making use of them there. That's the 2-for-1 special. We can get them out of England and reduce the social problems, and then on top of that, they can work over there, make us money, get us rich, and do it in a distant place. What better deal than that for them? Let's continue. 5 years later, in 1611, Velasco, the Spanish minister to England, said the same thing in different words. And this is what he said. Their principal reason for colonizing these parts is to give an outlet for so many idle, wretched people as they have in England, and thus prevent the dangers that might be feared of them. Whatever the rationale, one thing is clear: the idle, wretched people became the first fodder of colonialism, and they played this role under a system of forced labor with deep roots in European experience. By this time, of course, the institution of slavery had virtually died out in Europe, but other forms of forced labor, including the apprenticeship system, were common. And when the opening of the New World created a demand free labor could not satisfy, European power brokers created a system of forced labor based loosely on the old apprenticeship system. And so what was this apprenticeship system? It was when you had an inexperienced person work for a period of time for a master craftsman, right? And in exchange, this inexperienced person or this apprentice would receive food, a place to stay, and also training. And so Mr. Bennett Jr., he's saying that this forced labor system was based somewhat on this old system. And so he writes this: under the new system called indentured servitude, a person sold himself or was sold for a specific number of years, usually from 2 to 7, although some were sold into lifetime servitude to pay for the cost of his transportation to America. The indentured servants, as the first white bondsmen were called, signed a contract of indenture in England or America. And this is one of the major differences that separated most of the European servants from the Negro slaves. It wasn't necessarily the treatment, right? That's what he's arguing. It was the contract, right? The vast majority of the Negroes, they didn't have contracts. When the African slave catcher rounded them up, they weren't sold with terms of on a contract, right? They were just sold as is. Where most of the Europeans, they were sold with these contracts, right? The system of white servitude evolved in America, but it evolved within a context of experience that came to America with the first white immigrants, most of whom were de facto slaves. Basically a limited time slave or a slave that had a contract. Here we go. Something of this comes out of the history of Virginia, where before 1619, as Balog has proved, practically every inhabitant was a servant, manipulated in the interest of the Virginia Company, held in servitude beyond a stipulated term. And this is the cheating people out of their contracts, right? And making them serve longer than what they initially agreed on. Let's continue. This caused no end of trouble between the company and the servants, who complained repeatedly that they were being treated like slaves. The complaints of the white servants were by no means groundless, for the residents were driven to work in gangs and punished severely for minor infractions. Anyone who missed church on Sunday was to lie neck and heels that night and be a slave for a week. For the third offense, the person was to be a slave for a year and a day. Thus, the white founding fathers of Virginia. They were hardly alone, for roughly the same thing happened in Massachusetts, where the Puritans began their famous crusades for democracy by reducing to servitude a relatively large number of white men and women. It was in 1628, 8 years before the first evidence of Indian servitude and 10 years before the first hint of black servitude, that white bondage began in the Puritan Commonwealth. In that year, 180 servants landed at Salem to prepare the food and homes for the pioneers of the history books, who came over a year later. When the celebrated Mayflower arrived, the principle of white unfreedom came with it. At least 16 of the passengers were white indentured servants. Although some Indians were reduced to slavery and servitude in the first years of the English settlement, colonial masters evinced a decided preference for poor whites of Europe. From the start, poor white children from the streets and almhouses of London and Amsterdam were shipped to the colonies. Shipped like Amazon packages, right? There were also irregular shipments of laborers and maids, some of uncertain character. Beginning in 1619, a significant date, colonial masters began to shape this irregular traffic into an organized system. Ironically enough, the first step on this road was taken at the first meeting of a representative political body in America. At its first meeting in Jamestown in July 1619, the Virginia House of Burgesses provided for the recording and enforcement of contracts of indenture, made it illegal for female servants to marry without the consent of their masters, and authorized masters to whip their servants. And these were the ideas that were coming from the mind of the governing officials, right? They were meeting and then they were passing laws to shape the society and to get its members to function in a way that reflected the ideas that they had, right? And some of the ideas that they had were the controlling of women who they married, right? And allowing masters to put the whip on the servants, right? Now think about that. Let's continue. These acts legalized indentured servitude in Virginia and provided for a statutory class of unfree laborers. When the first blacks landed at Jamestown, they found the system of indentured servitude firmly established and most of the white population living in the shadows of chains. They were in the pit. Now, they didn't get dragged nearly as far down the pit as the Negro did, but they were still in the pit. Let's continue. Writing from Virginia in that year, John Porey said that our principal wealth consisteth in servants. This wealth, to use the current phrase, increased dramatically in the following years. In 1627, some 1,500 kidnapped children were sent to Virginia. And they were kidnapped from where? From Europe. And their services were so satisfactory that authorities pleaded for another shipment of the friendless boys and girls. And who knows what they were doing over there with them. In 1636, there were some 5,000 persons in Virginia, and it has been estimated that at least 3,000 of them had come to the colony as servants. All in all, it is said that at least 80,000 indentured servants were imported by Virginians in the colonial period. The story was very much the same in other colonies. Tens of thousands of displaced white persons streamed into Maryland, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas. In one 4-year period, some 25,000 white servants were shipped to Philadelphia alone. Because of the nature of the white servant trade, it is very difficult to determine precisely how many indentured servants were shipped to the colonies. It appears, however, and this is a very conservative estimate, that at least 250,000 persons were indentured servants during the colonial period, which is a lot of people, especially for that time. This figure, it is worth noting, does not include the sizable number who died during the White Middle Passage. Who are these people? Where did they come from? How did they come? The answer to these questions are to be found not in the myth of the pure white settlement, but in the short and simple annals of the poor and the oppressed. The cast of characters in this drama included victims of every imaginable description. They were political and military prisoners captured in war or rebellion, They were Quakers and Catholics fleeing Protestant oppression, Germans and Swiss Protestants fleeing Catholic oppression, and Jews fleeing Catholic and Protestant oppression. There were rogues, whores, orphans, convicts, and derelicts, all the mangled victims of the social and political upheavals of the time. People of every age and kind, Abot Emerson Smith wrote, were decoyed, deceived, seduced, inveigled, or forcibly kidnapped and carried as servants to the plantations. The servants came from all over Christian Europe, from Germany and Holland and Switzerland and Scotland. Most, however, came from England and Ireland. And who is included from this stock coming from Ireland? The ones who they called the wild and rebellious Irish, right? And we're going to see more about them coming up. Let's continue. They came, these Christian demi-slaves, the same way most blacks came, crammed shoulder to shoulder, toe to toe, the living and the dead side by side, in the unventilated holds of crowded ships. In this respect, as in others, there were striking similarities between the white servant trade and the black slave trade. It was not for nothing that the trade in Irish servants was called the Irish slave trade. The same techniques were used to capture Africans in Africa, Englishmen in England, and Germans in Germany. And the same ports, Bristol, Liverpool, were used by the same merchants and captains to transport them. Since it was widely believed that colonization was of so great advantage to the public, the courts were used to recruit white servants. Which means what? The courts were a tool. And that's why they were able to use the courts, right? And how did they use this tool called the courts? Let's find out. One could be sentenced in this period to transportation and 7 years exile in the colonies for a number of offenses, including petty theft, maiming and killing cattle, and trade union activity. Persons convicted of these and other crimes were shipped to the colonies and were known familiarly as His Majesty's 7-year passengers. And that's how they used the courts, right, as a loophole to penalize the people for certain offenses, right, by shipping them off like UPS packages to the New World. Let's continue. The best estimate suggests that at least 50,000 convicts were shipped to the American colonies in this period, and that most of them went to Virginia and Maryland, which were known in some circles as penal colonies. Also condemned for extended periods of servitude were Irish Catholic priests, Quakers, and Scottish and Irish soldiers taken in war or rebellion. In 1652, for instance, 270 Scotchmen captured at the Battle of Dunbar were sold in Boston. 1 year later, 100 Tories were transported from Ireland to be sold as slaves in America. And from what I found, Tories in this time of the 1600s, it referred to Irish rebels or Irish resistors of English conquest under Oliver Cromwell, right? But I could be wrong on that, but let's continue going. Some of the political prisoners, as the last example indicates, were slaves condemned, in the language of the day, to serve in our colonies in America during the term of their natural lives. That means as long as they were living, they were serving. Now next, Mr. Lerone Bennett Jr., he gives some examples of newspaper listings that show how some of these servants were advertised for sale. Right now, watch this. Just imported from Ireland and to be sold on board the ship Virtue, John Seymour, master, now in the harbor of Boston, a parcel of healthy men servants, chiefly tradesmen. Here's another example. Just arrived in the ship Sophia, Alexander Verdine, master, from Dublin, that's Ireland, 20 stout, healthy indentured, whose indentures will be disposed of on reasonable terms by the captain on board, or the subscribers, several very likely servants, tradesmen and husbandmen, lately arrived from Bristol, to be sold very reasonable by Captain Samuel Bromage or Mr. Thomas Sharp. You see that? There's more. It was not unusual for merchants to sell blacks, whites, and Indians from the same auction block. In 1714, Samuel Sewall, a prominent Boston merchant, offered for sale several Irish maidservants, tying most of them for 5 years, one Irish manservant who is a good barber and wig maker, also 4 or 5 likely Negro boys. And that's how they were doing it back then. That was real life for a lot of those people. And it's hard for a lot of us to imagine this happening today because The energy has shifted so far away from these type of practices, and America as a whole has climbed out of this pit, right? No one's walking around selling people in newspaper ads. But that was real life at that time for both the Negro and the Irish, as we've just seen. Now let's continue. Some enterprising and insensitive merchants called soul drivers bought servants in lots of 50 or more and drove them through the countryside, selling them ones and twos to local planters. It would be a mistake to assume that this was a subterranean business, condemned by men of substance and goodwill. On the contrary, the leading men of the colonies were engaged in it, both as buyers and sellers. And who were some of these leading men involved in this, you may ask? Here's the answer. George Washington bought white indentured servants. He had his presidential hands in the cookie jar. So did William Carter and Robert Beverly. Some of the leading colonial planters and merchants, such as Carter and Beverly of Virginia, had a hand in the Indian, European, and African trade. Once the sale was consummated, the servant became subject of the will, whim, and interest of another human being. In theory, as we have seen, he had limited legal rights, including the right of appeal to a court of masters. This was in theory. In practice, almost every student of white servitude has pointed out he was a de facto slave until the end of his indenture. And so the reality is that they functioned like slaves. They functioned like a slave until their contract was up. And again, the point that he's making is not to downplay the Negro's condition and to say that they were absolutely equal in all areas, right? That's not his argument. His argument is that they were treated similarly, and the only thing that saved the European servant was their contract coming to an end, right? Most of the Negroes, they didn't have any contracts to come to an end. So they were basically stuck at the bottom, right? And they got pushed further down in the bottom later on as the slavery advanced. Now let's continue reading. They became, in the eyes of the law, said J.B. McMaster, a slave, and in both the civil and criminal codes were classed with the Negro and the Indian. They were worked hard, were dressed in the cast-off clothes of their owners, and might be flogged as often as the master and mistress thought necessary. There was a similar testimony from T.J. Wharton Baker, who said that the indentured servants were practically slaves, being bound to the soil and forced to obey implicitly those whom they served. C.A. Herrick said that no matter how kindly they may have entered into the relation, as a class and when once bound, indentured servants were temporary chattels, or temporary pieces of personal property. Here we go. Most of the white servants were illiterate. Most of them were male, and most of them relatively free of racial prejudice. Most, moreover, were divided by internal boundaries relating to religion and nationality. It was based on religion and nationality. The idea of skin color and the black and white racial ideas, that had not come to be a dominant worldview at that time, right? And it is worthy of note that white planters commented at length on the racial characteristics of the various tribes of white people. And let's see what they said. Most observers said the Scotch and German servants were the best servants, and that the Irish were the worst. And why were the Irish the worst? Dr. Audrey Smelley told us in the book Race in North America that the Irish were said to be wild and rebellious. They revolted too much, right? And they often turned on their masters. And so obviously that type of temperament would be the worst type of temperament to have for someone that you want as a slave, right? That's obvious. Let's continue. One must remember, however, that the evidence comes almost entirely from the white upper class. The servant, like the slave, left few records to tell his side of the story. How did the servant fare under the system? How did white masters treat white servants? If we can credit contemporary witnesses and surviving records, white masters treated white servants the same way they treated black servants and black slaves. That is to say, they drove them hard in the fields, lashed them unmercifully, and appropriated their labor power. And like I said, they had to squeeze out as much labor as possible from these people that they had purchased. You have to remember one thing. The servants for these people were investments, right? And to get a good return on that investment, they needed those servants to work as much as possible within this constrained time frame that they had with them. And the whip was a good tool to ensure that that would happen. Let's continue. In general, it can be said, on the basis of contemporary reports and the writing of scholars, that the lot of the white servant was often worse than the lot of the slave. In a letter written in 1770, William Edis said that, Negroes being a property for life, the death of slaves in prime of youth and strength is a material loss to the proprietor. Meaning that the Negro is going to work for the entirety of their lives. And it's not a wise thing to work them so hard that they die in their youth when they're still super strong, right? Because that's going to be a loss on the master's part. Let's continue. They are therefore under more comfortable circumstances than the miserable Europeans, over whom the rigid planters exercise an inflexible severity. Generally speaking, they, white servants, groan beneath a worse than Egyptian bondage. And that's how it was explained in 1770, at least by one witness, that they were getting worked harder than an Egyptian slave. Now there's more. This testimony is corroborated by another contemporary witness, Richard Lignon, who said he saw in Barbados such cruelty done to servants as did not think one Christian could have done to another. Like the slaves, white servants ran away repeatedly, leaving the plantation late at night, beating their way through the forest, swimming creeks and rivers, pursued all the while by posses and dogs. In a general unsuccessful attempt to stop the flow of runaways, colonial masters adopted the first fugitive servant slave laws and filled colonial newspapers with revealing evidence on the barbarity of the system. Here are some typical ads for runaway white servants. Runaway, from the subscriber, living on Monocacy, Carroll's Manor, in Fredericks County, 6 miles from Frederick Town. On the 27th of December last, an indentured Irish servant man, known by the name of Patrick Quigley, a shoemaker by trade, of middling stature, well set, of ruddy complexion, short black hair, about 5 feet 2 or 3 inches high, 24 years of age. You see that? That's the Irish servant who took off. He wasn't having any of it. Here's another one. January 8th, 1785. Most of the advertisements were prosaic and matter-of-fact. Some, however, reflected creativity, if not compassion. Here we go. Last Wednesday noon, at break of day, from Philadelphia ran away an Irishman named John McCone, to fraud and imposition prone, about 5 feet 5 inches high, can curse and swear as well as lie. And so there's another example. Another one of an Irishman taking off and having the master writing poems about him. Let's continue. Not only were the white servants the basis of the wealth of the early colonies, they were also the basis of a huge growing system of servility. By the last decade of the 17th century, 1600s, servitude had become a part of the fabric of America. The system of indentured service in its social effects, Philip Bruce said, differed but little, if at all, from the system of slavery. It really accentuated the social division amongst the whites more distinctly than the presence of the institution of slavery. It gave purely class distinctions a recognized standing in colonial courts of law. It was not until the end of the century that Negro bondsmen became numerous on the plantations, and yet in social spirit, the 17th century in Virginia did not differ from the 18th. The ever-increasing multitude of African slaves after 1700 simply confirmed the social tendencies which had previously been fostered by the presence of the indentured whites. So in the earlier period of these English colonies in America and in the Caribbean, it was not a smooth ride and an easy ride for these lower class Europeans. And although most of them were contracted laborers, they still had to get out there and work the fields and work the land, just like the Negroes had to do. And they were used in these earlier periods, in many instances, just like the enslaved Negroes were used. But they just had a limited time contract on them. Now, this is not to say that they had the same exact status, but they were treated in a very similar manner. And when we consider this, and when we get this sense of understanding, then it makes a lot more sense as to why some people would want to hide this type of information and gloss over it in the history books. But not us. We need all of the information being brought into the light. And so hopefully you have been able to learn something from this bit of overlooked history on European rough and rugged servitude as the first laborers in early colonial America. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.